images iconic? What do we learn about them, from them, about the time? So starting with this image, does anyone recognize this? You can just unmute and call out. Does anyone recognize where this image is from? So this was one of the iconic images from the Depression. Historians have looked at this image, and the reason it became so famous is it really summed up the despair, the desolation, the depression, so to speak, of the Depression. And there were a lot of political policies that came out of the Depression, aid for women and children, that kind of are tied to this image and the feelings that this image evoked. You know, on the opposite end of the spectrum, I'm sure some of you recognize this image, the iconic image of the end of World War II. What do you see when you look at this image? I mean, I'm sorry?
Happiness and love.
Right, exactly, right? The joy, the euphoria of the World War II ending. Of course, there's a misunderstanding behind the picture, and that's that, you know, you look at this picture and you assume this is a couple reuniting when really they didn't know each other. And this was a random man grabbing a random woman on the street, which kind of tells a little bit of a different story. I think we'd all rather it be a couple reuniting than two strangers. This image, does anyone recognize this? Andy Warhol's famous paintings, you know, very much symbolic of the counterculture and statements that he was making about consumerism and celebrity worship. And finally, this famous image, which is the 9/11 image, resilience. It kind of evokes the Iwo Jima image, you know, the feeling of like perseverance. So today what I want to do is look at some much lesser known images from colonial America and some letters from colonial America, from the Jewish community, and discuss what these images teach us about Jewish life in America, both then and now. So here's a little bit of background to Jews in the colonial era. So Jewish history in America began in 1654 with the arrival of 23 Jews from Recife, Brazil. Now, they had been living peacefully in Recife, which was a Dutch colony, for decades. And I have two images here from Recife. One is a drawing, a piece of art from depicting what Recife would have looked like at the time. And then a contemporary photograph of Recife, but I think you can still see the architecture and, you know, the palm trees. You kind of get a feel for what Recife was like. Recife was beautiful. It was tropical. It had lovely weather. There was a robust Jewish community in Recife, Brazil. And so they would be living there peacefully. But here's the problem. The problem is that the different European powers were vying for control of colonies. And Portugal was fighting against Amsterdam, against the Dutch, for control of Recife. And ultimately, they lost. The Dutch lost, and Portugal took over the area. When Portugal took control of Brazil, they brought with them the Inquisition. Now, this was a massive problem for the Jews who were living in Recife, Brazil, because many of them had been former conversos. Their families had been conversos living in Spain and Portugal. And then when they moved to Amsterdam, Amsterdam being a Protestant country with no Inquisition, they did a whole, guess what, everyone, we're really Jewish. Then they moved to the colonies, you know, for economic opportunity, and they find themselves again subject to the Inquisition. So being that they were Jews who were formerly new Christians and had now stepped up and said, hey, we're really Jewish, they had to get out of there fast. I mean, they had just a target on their back. So most of the Jews of Recife, Brazil, went back to Amsterdam. But 23 of them decided, instead of going back to Europe, to travel instead to the nearest Dutch colony. And the nearest Dutch colony was a small, primitive outpost called New Amsterdam, which we all know would later become New York. So here are some images of New Amsterdam. You can see kind of the comparison. It was not a great area. It was not well developed. It was definitely, in terms of standard of living, a major step down. So how do we know they arrived? Well, for one, this was again in September, there were records of services held that Rosh Hashanah, which fell out about 10 days after they landed. We also know they arrived because court records show that within a few days of their arrival, these 23 Jews were suing each other. So the Jewish community had friction almost from day one. Now, the question historians ask is, or what I want to ask about historians is, why do we consider this the first community? They're not actually the first Jews in America. There were a number of Jewish men, mostly single merchants, who had passed through the colonies, who had passed through New Amsterdam before. So why then? Why are these 23 considered the first Jewish community? There are two major answers. One is because this group got official permission to stay. So Peter Stuyvesant, who was the governor of New Amsterdam, and who, if you've lived in New York's name probably is somewhat familiar, shows up like around town. Peter Stuyvesant was the governor of New Amsterdam, and he tried to get the Jews kicked out of the colony. He was afraid, hey, if you let in the Jews, then you have to let in the Catholics, and then there goes the neighborhood. So he wanted the Jews out. So the Jews of New Amsterdam wrote to the Jewish community in Amsterdam and asked for their help. And Amsterdam Jews successfully appealed to the Dutch West Indies Company, which had control of the colony, and got official permission to stay. Now, how'd they do that? Well, for one, Jews were investors in the Dutch West Indies Company. And what they argued was that Jews are good for the economy. And that is the argument that prevails. That's a major, major shift from decisions being made on the basis of religion, like the country makes decisions based on what's good for the church, to the concept of mercantilism, which is that we make decisions based on what's good for the economy. It's kind of the old versus the new argument. And Peter Stuyvesant was representing the old-fashioned way of thinking, and the Amsterdam Jews prevailed with a new way of thinking. The other piece that's different about these 23 is that they came in family units, men, women, and children. And there is no community without all three. Merchants traveling alone do not make a community. Families create a community and a future. By the time the United States was born in 1776, this community of 23 had grown to about 2,000. Just as a basis of comparison, so the Jewish population in the world was approximately 1 million in 1654 and 2 million in 1776. And the vast, vast majority of the world lived in two areas: Poland, Lithuania, the Ashkenazi population, and the Ottoman Empire, which is the Sephardic population. So when you're thinking about, this population, it's really quite a small percentage. Now, just to tell you a little tidbit here, the first Jewish resident of Canada is dated to 1759. That community was also slow starting. And the reason I want to mention it is just because I want an excuse to segue and tell you one of my favorite stories of this era. This man, Samuel Jacobs, who's dated as the first Jew in Canada, was actually not the first, because in 1738, when Canada was still a French colony, a 20-year-old Jewish young woman named Esther Brandow, for reasons unknown, masqueraded herself as a Catholic boy, became a sailor, and went to Canada. And once her gender and her religion were discovered, she was arrested, and the government tried to pressure her to convert. But after a year, she still refused to convert, saying she wanted to live in Canada as a Jew. But alas, the French government would not allow it, and she was sent back to France, and that's the last we ever hear about her. We know nothing else about her story. So again, all through North America, Jewish population was really, really small. Now today, the two major Jewish centers of the world are North America and Israel, but that's really a recent creation. That's the creation of the post-Holocaust world. So if Jews in the colonial era, if it was such a small number, if they're, in terms of significance, we might as well be talking about the Jews of Alaska. So what do we care? Why do we care to learn about them? The reason we care is because studying colonial Jews is much more than just studying colonial Jews. Although numerically small, these Jews were so interesting. They were facing many of the same issues that we encounter today. This couple of thousand Jews living in the 18th and early 19th century, they were a unique and colorful bunch. And by examining their lives, their connection to Judaism, and their values, we can learn a great deal about ourselves as American Jews and about the challenges, struggles, and triumphs of the American Jewish community today. So let's start with a little bit of an art analysis. This is a painting called Martha Levy at the Spinet. It's a portrait. Portraiture was very common for the time. Having one's portrait painted was a symbol of wealth and status in both Europe and the Americas. This painting was actually painted by a renowned portrait artist named Thomas Scully in 1810. So looking at this picture, what do you see? What do you think it could tell you about the American Jewish community? Looking at her dress, looking at what she's doing. Does she seem wealthy or poor? And if you have your portrait painted, it's a pretty fair assumption that you're wealthy. She seems literate. She's standing in front of a spinet, which was a musical instrument. She plays an instrument. She's high class, she's high culture, she's well-dressed. So looking at that, it leads us, the viewer, to assume about Jewish life that there were certainly Jews who were successful, who were wealthy, who were educated, and they wanted to fit in. Because this is a standard high society portrait. There's nothing specifically Jewish about this. And I actually want to tell you a little backstory about this painting. Martha Levy wasn't Jewish. Her father was Judge Moses Levy, who was a Jew from a well-respected colonial Jewish family. Her mother was Mary Pierce Levy, an Episcopalian Methodist Christian. Martha was raised as a Methodist and left no Jewish descendants. So that adds another layer here, right? We said, before looking at it, you could see that Jews wanted to fit in. But now, how much do they want to fit in? It makes us think about what the rate of intermarriage was. Was Martha Levy typical? She actually was. Rate of intermarriage in the colonial era was as high as 25%. Now, while in our days, when intermarriage rates can be 50% or more, that might seem low. But in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the intermarriage rate in the rest of the Jewish world was next to nothing. It was zero. So 25%, that was astronomical. So why is the rate of intermarriage in the colonial Jewish community so high when it's so low everywhere else in the world? So let's take a step back and think about the situation in America for Jews who might have immigrated in the colonial era. If they came, they didn't mind living without a Jewish infrastructure. There were no major Jewish organizations, no yeshivot, no rabbis. We believe in New York. In New York, certainly by 1760s, they had a mikvah. But in Philadelphia, 1784, large established community, and there's a petition to build a mikvah because they didn't even have it yet. So they didn't have like the basic institutions that we take for granted. There was also no concept of Jewish time. If you're thinking about where these Jews were coming from, so they're coming from Europe. In Europe, the Jewish communities were fairly insular. So if I asked you what time of year it is, you would tell me it's Adar, it's almost Purim, and then it's between Purim and Pesach. What time of day is it? It's Mariv time. Like the time they lived in was Jewish. I think sometimes when we visit Israel, you get a little bit of a taste of this. if you're ever in Israel around Hanukkah time, but they were living in Jewish time. You come to America, you're really the minority. There's nothing Jewish happening around you. And that's a big culture shock for a lot of people. The people who came also had to not really care about wanting rabbinic authority, because there were no rabbis in America. There was no rabbinical authority, and there really was not much religious authority at all, especially in the Wild West. In America, Judaism was voluntary. You could choose. You want to practice Judaism? You don't want to practice Judaism. And that was very different from Europe, where rabbis held a lot of power and community leaders could mandate observance. There was no intellectual defense of not practicing Judaism like there was in Europe with Haskalah and the Reform movement. They just didn't practice. Someone didn't want to keep halacha, didn't want to keep Shabbat, so don't. Nobody was looking over their shoulders. There weren't going to be any social consequences, so to speak. Similarly, America, to quote the literary scholar Werner Solers, America is about consent, not descent. America doesn't care about your heritage. America doesn't care about your lineage. Right? Britain was all about descent, as anyone who's watched Downton Abbey or The Crown can tell you. Right? Your place in society is determined by your birth. America is about consent. You choose your identity, the self-made man. And that ethos is not conducive to heritage, including religious heritage. And certainly they wouldn't care about religious yichus, about somebody having prestigious lineage. The people who came were people who were interested in making money. That was the reason to go. They were adventurous, they were risk takers, and they weren't necessarily religious to start with. The people who choose to come to America are somewhat of a self-selecting population. So if they chose to come, then probably they weren't so religiously committed to begin with. So with this list of qualities, we might think there'd be no Jewish community at all in America. Did anyone care about being Jewish? So some people definitely did. And I want to show you an example of a letter. This is a letter written by an immigrant from Central Europe. And her name was Rebecca Samuels, and she was writing back to her parents in Hamburg in the 1790s. Dear parents, I hope my letter will ease your mind. You can now be reassured and send me one of the family to Charleston, South Carolina. So, more of the family can come over. That's the place with God's help we're going after Passover. The whole reason why we are leaving this place is because of its lack of Jewishness. So again, they're living in Petersburg, Virginia, which was a small Jewish community. Dear parents, I know quite well you will not want me to bring up my children like Gentiles. Here they cannot become anything else. Jewishness is pushed aside here. There are here 10 or 12 Jews, and they're not worthy of being called Jews. We have a shochet who goes to market and buys treif meat and then brings it home. It's actually a fabulous imagery, right, to describe the time period. If the shochet goes, slaughters the animals so people can have kosher food, and then he himself goes and buys treif. And Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, she gives all these examples of how Jewishly desolate this community is. On Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the services, the synagogue had no Sefer Torah. Not one of them wore the talit or the arba kanfo tzitzit, except Hyman, that's her husband, and my Sammy, her son's godfather. The latter's an old man of 60 from Holland, and he's going to go with them when they move to Charleston. Now, why are they going to Charleston? Because in that place, there's a blessed community of 300 Jews. That's the big the bigger Jewish community. The big community that she's going to move to has 300 Jews. You can believe me, I crave to see a synagogue to which I can go. The way we live now is no life at all. We don't know what the Sabbath and the holidays are. On the Sabbath, all the Jewish shops are open, and they do business on that day, as they do throughout the whole week. But ours, we do not allow to open. With us, there is still some Sabbath. You must believe me that in our house, we all live as Jews as much as we can. So here you get this idea of the lack of Jewish time, of not feeling like there is Shabbos in this community. As for the Gentiles, we have nothing to complain about. For the sake of a livelihood, we do not have to leave here. So those are two really important points here. We have nothing to complain about the Gentiles. That's her way of saying they don't face anti-Semitism. And financially, they're doing great. And then she goes on to detail that. Ever since Hyman has grown up, he has not had it so good. You cannot know what a wonderful country this is for the common man. One can live here peacefully. No one's bothering them. And then she goes on to talk about how her husband is a clockmaker and a silver maker. And that's totally cool. He can do both of those. But in Europe, where there were all these guilds, so first of all, if Jews could even be in a certain profession, right, there was all these rules. If you do this, then you can't do that. But, you know, in Europe, there's all these like guild restrictions. But in America, hey, if you're good, that's what matters. No one cares. You know, no one cares. You want to make clocks and make silver? Great. So, and she talks about, you know, all the amazing business they're doing and the different crops, how great the economy is here in Petersburg. When Judah, so her brother, that's who's hopefully coming, he can be a watchmaker and a goldsmith if he so desires. Here it is not like Germany, where a watchmaker is not permitted to sell silverware. They don't know otherwise here. They expect a watchmaker to be a silversmith here. So the work is well paid. Skipping down to end that paragraph, the work is well paid here, but in Charleston, it pays even better. All the people who hear that we are leaving give us their blessings. They say it is sinful that such blessed children should be brought up here in Petersburg. My children cannot learn anything here, nothing Jewish, nothing of general culture. My Shon, God bless her, is already 3 years old. I think it is time she should learn something, and she has a good head to learn. I have taught her the bedtime prayers and grace after meals in just 2 lessons. And I believe that no one among the Jews here can do as well as she. And my Sammy, God bless him, is already beginning to talk. I could write more. However, I do not have any more paper. Just an unbelievable, so to wrap your head around. Like, not only are we not emailing here, but she's literally ending this letter because there's no more paper to write. I remain your devoted daughter and servant, Rebecca, the wife of Chaim, the son of Samuel the Levite. It's a fabulous letter. I mean, there's so much here that tells us about Jewish life, from how religiously desolate it is on one end to the acceptance by the Christian outside world and the minimal to no overt anti-Semitism and being allowed to be in professions they wouldn't have been allowed in Europe and being able to be financially successful. Rebecca, how does Rebecca feel about America? She likes America. Would she choose to leave America? No, but she acknowledges difficulties with maintaining tradition. How will she manage to raise Jewishly committed children? Rebecca Samuels recognizes she's living in a Jewishly desolate area. Therefore, she finds a better one, and she moves her family to an area with a stronger Jewish environment. So looking at her letter together with Martha Levy, so they love, I mean, the Jews in America, they love the surrounding Christian world's acceptance of them. It's great. But there's uncertainty on how to continue to live a religious Jewish life here. How do we balance being participants in American culture and society with being committed Jews? And that is the global American question. Right? We're a nation of immigrants, but one with very strong American culture. How do we maintain our cultures and our traditions within America while being a part of America? So to help us answer, I want to look at another colonial woman, Abigail Levy Franks. This is a set of portraits of the Franks family. The woman on the left is Abigail Levy Franks, who was a doyen of colonial New York society, a real high-class society woman, and a Jew. The children on her right are her children, David and Rika, which would be Rivka. She is, in fact, related to Martha Levy, the girl at the spinet. And these portraits were also painted by prominent artists in 1735. So Abigail Levy Franks was born in London in 1696 into a prominent Jewish family. She and her family settled in the colonies in 1703, She married Jacob Franks, who was a wealthy Jewish merchant, and she died in New York in 1756. So looking at these portraits, we can learn a lot about her. Clothing is very fashionable. She's dressed in American styles more than any Jewish style. If you look at her hands, there's so much detail on her hands, the children's hands. Hands were a sign of a status symbol in that day and age. A woman who worked, who did her own dishes, her hands wouldn't be so perfect. So having these like perfect genteel hands was to say you were high class. The pastoral scene behind them was very trendy for the time. I find it very unlikely that was the view out of their window in Manhattan, but it was very trendy. The children are beautifully dressed. The two portraits are made to hang together. And what's interesting, being that we're going to find out that they were a committed Jewish family, there's nothing Jewish in these portraits at all. No mezuzah, no menorah in the background. I mean, just nothing. But these portraits are not all we know about Abigail Levy Franks. Abigail was a prolific letter writer, and her correspondence is one of the richest we have of any woman in the colonial era, Jew or not Jew. Historians know a lot about her from the letters she wrote to her oldest son, to her son Naphtali, who was living in London. He had gone to London to work with his uncle and seek his fortune as a young adult. She actually sent two sons to London in hopes they'd succeed financially and marry Jewish. Abigail loved Naphtali. She missed him all the days of her life. Sending her son to London wasn't like sending a kid off to college today. When she sent him away, she knew that the odds were she was never going to see him again. She never met his wife. She never met her grandchildren. Abigail Levy Franks, along with her husband Jacob, they were pillars of the New York Jewish community, and they were also in high social standing in non-Jewish society. They lived an observant Jewish life. Jacob Franks was a trustee of She'erith Israel, which is the first congregation in America. Her children attended She'erith Israel's school. Abigail kept a kosher home. She observed Shabbos. She observed holidays. She believed in God and in Judaism. She instructed Naphtali, living with her brother in London, to pray every morning and not to eat anything but bread and butter in his home because she did not trust her brother's kashrus. But despite this strong connection to Jewish heritage, she writes very little about Judaism in her letters. She writes about literature, she writes about political goings-on, social going-ons in great detail, but no description of Shabbos or holiday meals, no description of shul services or any other ritual practice. When she does mention the Jewish community of New York, she expresses disdain. She writes to Naphtali one time how she doesn't really socialize with the other Jewish women in New York, saying, "I don't often see any of our ladies but at synagogue, for they are a stupid set of people, but mum for that." So clearly she had, opinions about the other Jewish women, and I think a sense that she was in a higher social strata. The Franks, they were invested in American society, culture, politics. She didn't see herself as living a separate existence from her non-Jewish neighbors. She's well educated. She's an Enlightenment thinker. Her Judaism seems almost taken for granted. She observes, but she doesn't really think too much about it, which is why it's so fascinating to see her reaction to the event in her life that most tortured her. In September of 1742, Phyla Franks, her beloved daughter, intermarried. In the end, of her 3 children that remained in the United States, 2 intermarried and 1 did not marry at all. Phyla married a man named Oliver Delancey. If the last name sounds familiar, it probably does, like Delancey Street on the Lower East Side. There was a mayor of New York who was a Delancey. Oliver Delancey was a Christian, and he was a Delancey, which means it's not like she eloped with the chauffeur. She married a member of high society. And Abigail, this woman who never really wrote about her Judaism, never really expressed many feelings about her heritage, was absolutely devastated when Phila marries a non-Jew. Look at this letter here. So first of all, it's dated from Flatbush. Flatbush was the country. That's where you VBRO'd a vacation home. You wanted to do that? You went to Flatbush. So in Flatbush, Dear Heartsea, that was her nickname for her son, Naphtali. So she starts by wishing him congratulations on being happily married, which is a euphemism for his wife expecting their first child. And it's a little sad here. She's writing how she's going to be so nervous, it's going to be so hard for her to wait till she hears the news that the baby is born, but it's not going to make it on this set of ships. So maybe the next set of ships. It's just a realization that her grandchild's going to be born, and that child will probably be 3 months old before she knows, before she knows the baby's born, before she knows what it is, knows a name. It's just a really, just a totally different way of living here. Okay, so a few lines down here. You can see my cursor, right? Can you see my cursor? Yeah. I am now retired from town and would from myself, if it were possible, to have some peace of mind from the severe affliction I am under the conduct of that unhappy girl. Good God, what a shock it was when they acquainted me she had left the house and had been married 6 months. So her daughter had secretly married Oliver Delancey 6 months ago, but had been living at home this whole time while being secretly married. And now she left to go live with her husband. I can hardly hold my pen while I'm writing it. It was what I never could have imagined, especially after what I heard her so often to say, that no consideration in life should ever induce her to disoblige such good parents, right? How could she do this? But as such reports had often been of either of your sisters, like she heard reports, right? There were rumors that maybe she was going to marry Oliver Delancey, but there were always rumors. So she didn't really take him seriously, but just goes to show, that this was the society that they were spending time with. So I kept an eye on her. It was fine. Her conduct was always unblemished, and still it is in the eyes of the Christian, who allows she has disobliged us, but in no way been dishonorable, being married to a man of worth and character. So, in her eyes, this was like a major crime, but in the eyes of the Christians, like, okay, yeah, we understand you upset your parents, but she didn't do anything like quote unquote dishonorable. She's married to him and he's a high society, he's high society. My spirits was for some time so depressed that it was a pain to me to speak or see anyone. I have overcome it so far as not to make my concerns so conspicuous, but I shall never have that serenity nor peace of mind that I've so happily had hitherto. And she goes on about how she wishes she could never go back to Manhattan again. She wants to just run away from society and never have to see anyone again. She says here that Oliver is trying to broker a reconciliation, and she's willing to talk to Oliver. She's not going to be rude to him, even though she would love to be, but she's willing to talk to Oliver. But she says, I will be civil, though I never will give him leave to come to my house in town. And as for his wife, I am determined. I never will see, nor let none of you family go near her. She writes that she vows never to see or speak to her daughter again. And she doesn't. She follows through on that. She never speaks to her daughter. Her husband was ready to give in. Her husband was ready to have a reconciliation, see her, but she stood with it and never saw her again. So why did Phila intermarry, right? I mean, it's possible that there was no one Jewish who was her social equal. A greenhorn, some new immigrant, that's not going to work. And you see how her mother refers to the Jews of New York. They seem to not be on her social strata. And it's possible that her mother that Phila absorbed her mother's attitude and that feeling of the Jews of New York not quite being on their level. Historians have pointed out that it's startling to read her reaction to Phila's intermarriage. But given how much Judaism didn't seem important to her, why suddenly is her daughter dead to her? Scholars might have a hard time understanding, but I think it's clear to us. I think we understand her sorrow. She didn't succeed in transmitting Judaism. She thought her daughter would naturally inherit her beliefs, but she didn't. One scholar of Abigail Levy-Frank's, Edith Gallis, explains it like this. Abigail took religion for granted, like nature, and Phila had transgressed against nature. So confident was she about her own Jewish identity, enough so that she felt free to criticize the religion and the people, that she was stunned to discover that her children did not experience the same fundamental loyalty to their lineage. So, on some level, there's kind of a mixture of circumstances of there really not being a lot of people to marry within colonial Jewish America, and between, her daughter kind of absorbing her mother's negativity, but not having kind of naturally inherited her mother's positivity towards Judaism, which she unfortunately failed to really transmit. Now, I don't want you to think that nobody married Jewish. Plenty married Jewish. And Dr. Benjamin Rush, who's a famous Christian doctor, was invited to a Jewish wedding, and he writes about it. And his description of the wedding is really fascinating. And I want to talk about this source, his description of the wedding, and then about the couple, the parents of the bride. So he's writing his wife, being called a few days ago to attend in the family of Jonas Phillips. So he was called because he was called as a doctor to treat Mrs. Phillips. This morning, I was honored with an invitation to attend the marriage of his daughter. I absolutely love the concept of inviting people to weddings the morning of. Like, that was it. That's when you got invited. Today's the wedding. Come on over. So he describes at 1:00, 60 or 40 men assemble in the Phillips common room, and there were benches. And the ceremony began with prayers chanted in a Hebrew language, what I can only assume was probably mincha. So they started with mincha. He didn't understand a word except now and then an amen or a hallelujah. And he was kind of distracted by, this is interesting, like as soon as the prayers began, they all covered their heads. And then the freedom with which some of them conversed with each other during the whole time of this part of worship. So apparently talking in shul is not something new in our generation. That's been going on for hundreds of years. He goes on to describe the ceremony, and it's interesting to see the similarities and differences. The writing of the ketubah he describes. He then describes the ceremony, the chuppah, and talks about a lot of the explanation. He was asking a lot of questions to the people there to explain what was happening. He talks about the wine, and this I actually find really fascinating. The groom at the bottom of that first page, 38, the groom, after sipping the wine, took the glass in his hand and threw it upon a large pewter dish, which was suddenly placed at his feet. Upon its breaking into a number of small pieces, there was a general shout of joy and a declaration that the ceremony was over. So we still have the breaking of the glass and then the big, cue the band Mazel Tov. But he didn't. So the groom didn't stomp on the glass. The groom threw the glass. And he asked why, what was the reason for the breaking of the glass? And that's at the end of that first paragraph on the second page. Breaking of the glass was designed to teach them the brittleness and uncertainty of human life and the certainty of death, and thereby to temper and moderate their present joys. So when I first read that, I found that really interesting that, we know why we break the glass. We break the glass to remember the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And it seems like, well, either they didn't know that piece, or maybe that's not how they explained it. But really learning more about it, this reason that he gave them was actually correct. That if you go back to the original source of breaking the glass in the Gemara, this is the reason. It's not the mention of the Beit HaMikdash's destruction, but it's this about the brittleness of life. And if you read Jewish Action in this past issue, there was actually a whole discussion of the minhag of breaking the glass and at what point, how it originated and how it's now become all kind of like a combination of the brittleness and the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, which also, we're supposed to always remember at every happy occasion, the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and how this minhag on some level got combined. But the author of that article then brings this story as an example of how other times in history that the reason really was the reason that is given in the Gemara for this custom. So I found that really interesting. So Dr. Rush has to leave, but he wants to go check on Mrs. Phillips, who had passed out during the ceremony from the heat. He says that she was weak from a previous indisposition. Historians think she was probably pregnant, and that's why she passed out. But I actually find this absolutely hysterical. He goes upstairs to look for Mrs. Phillips, and he says, I discovered the bride and groom supping a bowl of broth together. And Mrs. Phillips apologized for them by telling me that they'd eaten nothing since the night before. I'm reading this and reading how like he walked in on something and the mother was so awkward. I think he walked in on the yichud room, which is really kind of just this whole funny imagery. Like he kind of realizes something was awkward, but didn't really realize why. And then, he gives an end piece to his wife, and, his end part is how like, oh, these are really nice Jewish people are really nice. I kind of hope they, convert to Christianity. I'll leave it at that. I want to talk about the parents. So fine. So this is the example of the Jewish wedding of the time, the Jewish couple, and the parents, Jonas and Rebecca Machado Phillips. So Rebecca Machado Phillips, she was a Sephardic woman. She was the daughter of conversos from Lisbon, Portugal. They had been conversos for many generations, but the pressure from the Inquisition got really hot, especially because they were very, very wealthy and therefore were very much hated and resented. So they decide they have to get out of Portugal, but if they leave, they can't take any of their money with them. So they devised this ruse where the women sewed diamonds and jewels into their clothing, and they liquidated their assets into gold and made like belt buckles out of gold, and the men were wearing them on their belts. And they pretended to be going out to lunch with an English captain on his ship. And then when they got on the boat, they just sped away and out of there. So they escape, they go from there to Amsterdam, they end up in America. So Rebecca herself says, interesting that in converso families, the women tended to be more pious, like they were the ones who were more likely to pass along rituals, and that aspects of converso-ness lasted. Like the women in Rebecca's family continued to pray holding rosary beads, the way they did when they were conversos. She was literate, she had some education, she was wealthy. We don't really know what she learned, but it was probably more domestic than academic, like needlework, etiquette, music, dancing. She marries at the age of 16, which was actually quite young. She marries Jonas Phillips, who was 27 at the time. He was Ashkenazi, and as was common at the time, Sephardim were considered higher class in colonial society. So this marriage was a social move up for Jonas, and he adopted a Sephardic identity, not the opposite. So their marriage started a little difficult. They had some years of financial instability, and they lost 4 children before the age of 1. She actually had 21 children, pregnancies, which historians think were a record for American Jewish families, and most of them did survive to adulthood. They were very involved in Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. They fundraised to help get shul objects. They fundraised to get mantles for the Torah, curtains for the Aron. Rebecca was one of the founding members of the Female Association for the Relief of Women and Children in Reduced Circumstances. They did a lot of philanthropy with the poor. So this is a set of portraits. She's painted together with her husband, and it's meant to be hung side by side with them looking at each other. They are dressed in the fashion of the time. What's interesting, though, about this, and it's kind of a contrast to Abigail Levy Franks, is that usually paintings of women had a domestic or a fertility symbol, and she's holding a book instead, which is maybe suggesting learnedness or piety. Now, I think the portraits have a very different feel than the Franks families. They're a little bit more toned down. Maybe they weren't as high society or as wealthy. Maybe it was the difference between New York and Philadelphia, or maybe they were just a little more involved in the religious community. So what can we deduce from colonial Jews from these three images? Martha Levy at the spinet, the portraits, the two sets of portraits, and all of the primary sources, the letters. We know that colonial Jews struggled a great deal with how to square their Judaism with the very non-Jewish and very welcoming world around them. They did not suffer much anti-Semitism or legal discrimination in this country. They were, for the most part, accepted, loved, even married by their Christian neighbors. And they weren't very religious, because if they had been, they wouldn't have come to America to begin with. But their Judaism was still important to them. They still wanted to live Jewish lives, and they had trouble figuring out where to draw the line between fitting into the society in which they lived and separating themselves from that society. They worried about how to transmit their feelings about being Jewish to their children, and they despaired when they felt they had failed at that task. And in the end, that is why studying colonial Jews is just so incredibly compelling. In the end, they're so much like us. We too live in a society that's kind and welcoming. We struggle with how much to fit into general society in America and how much to differentiate ourselves as Jews. We wonder whether we are accurately and effectively transmitting Jewish values to the next generation. And that's the magic of studying Jewish history, that sometimes we look back into the past and are surprised to see ourselves reflected back at us. We have the opportunity to learn from those who came before us and to understand ourselves better through their eyes. Thank you. Does anyone have questions? Here's my contact info if you want to take a screen capture or take a picture with your phone if you want to contact me later. Anyone have questions?